I think most people who knew me in the 70s knew that I was running around avoiding being an academic. I was trying to avoid getting involved with academia in any way that I could. And for me, academia was the hound of heaven, which is a reference to, for those of you who may not remember, it's a reference to a poem by T.S. Eliot. I was being followed around by this thing that was saying, this is what you are, this is who you are, admit it, you've got to admit it. Everything you do in your life says this is what you are, and yet you're looking the other way.
This time, our friend Sandy Stone returns to the Plutopia podcast. Sandy is a renowned media theorist, artist, educator, and engineer. We discuss her work with Olivia Records and the controversy her transgender status attracted. Sandy also details her experiences in higher education at UC San Diego, UC Santa Cruz, the University of Texas, and the creation of ACTLab.
By way of introduction here to the Plutopia podcast, this latest episode, we have a return visit from Sandy Stone. And by way of introduction, I'm going to read something that I included when I interviewed Sandy back in 1998. At the beginning of that interview, I had this little piece from Honoria Starbuck, who had been one of Sandy's students. Honoria had said, deep in the heart of Technopolis, Austin, Sandy Stone is the vibrant theoretical force of UT's ACTLab, where technicians, scholars, and artists shape globally recognized projects as expanding interconnectivity forces new configurations of creativity, futurity, and power. Wow.
Wow.
You remember that? I just noticed there that Technopolis was misspelled as Technolopolis.
That'll do. More syllables.
Well, and that was in the Austin Chronicle, and the title of that piece, which was mostly an interview with you, was "No Stone Untenured."
I love the title. It has.
I wish I could claim credit for it, but somebody at the Chronicle came up with that.
Oh, really? I thought you did.
I wish I could say I did, but I don't think I did. I think it was somebody there, but it was a great title.
That's pretty good for the Cron.
Yeah, date you could claim it. I'm sure they have all moved on.
Well, maybe I should take back what I said. I don't know.
We'll pretend you didn't say it.
So, well, Sandy.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, there's a lot of things that we could talk about. The last time you were here, we kind of talked about your early life. And this time, one thing we would like to talk about is your experiences at the University of Texas. But before that, just want to mention that, you're sort of known as a foremost theorist, an academic theorist, a media theorist, and a transgender theorist, all of those sort of theorist titles. How do you feel about being a theorist?
Well, I don't think of myself as being a theorist. I think of myself as being a theoretician, but that's kind of a Weasley distinction. It's okay. I mean, my experience of my life is one person sees me as one thing, another person sees me as another. I don't have any control over that. So people can see me whatever way they want. And that's a part of me that that works that way. I mean, if people see me as a theoretician, that's what I am, because I've done something to make them see me as a theoretician. So I'm very comfortable with that.
My recollection is that when we did a different interview from this one that we did for Mondo 2000 magazine, about half of that interview was published, but the half that was not published was you talking at length about different identities that you sort of had within your head. So you don't necessarily think of yourself as the same person all the time, right?
No, not at all. Nor does anyone else, for that matter. Right. Let's do it unconsciously.
You were sort of just articulating it a little more clearly than most people can in their own minds. But one of the interesting things about that is that we've talked a lot about sort of the theory of identity online and the fact that you can adopt any identity that you choose online. It's a little harder now because, I mean, back in the day we were talking about this, people didn't really see images of the people they were talking to online. Mm-hmm. And you could very easily sort of remake yourself and create in the other person's mind a persona that was somewhat unlike you as you might see yourself in everyday life. And that was, I think, one of the powers of the internet. Do you agree?
Absolutely, but I'm not sure when you say that worked in a non-visual medium. I don't think you mean doesn't work in a visual medium too. Let me go put my cat filter on.
Or your catfish filter on, for that matter.
For that matter.
Yeah, early on in Facebook, I was actually friended by a couple of my friends' dogs, and the dogs responded. Of course, it was my idiot friends, but I didn't realize it for quite a while, and finally they changed the made-up picture that they had of just some generic person, and they put the actual dog up there just to humiliate me, but that was fun.
On the internet, no one knows you're a dog. So let's talk about how you got to UT. And before UT, I mean, there was a whole thing. There's an interesting story about what happened at Olivia Records. We could talk about that too.
Okay, I don't mind, but that's not directly in line with how I got to UT. So pick one or the other, and we can go off there.
Well, we could start with Olivia Records because I know that. That sort of led you to write The Empire Strikes Back, which was, for you, a pretty famous piece of work.
Okay, let's see how to start that. I was living in Santa Cruz when I met the Olivia people. And that started while I was running a small business in Santa Cruz, just to keep body and soul together and put bread on the table. They had originally gone to San Francisco to look for a woman engineer. They had a very good engineer working with them, but they were getting a little out of her depth, and she was busy, and she wanted to the collective felt that they wanted to find a woman who was more experienced with working with more of a standard, what we would call standard.
And why was it important for it to be a woman?
Because Olivia was started as a women's music company with the idea in mind that while women were having problems getting access to mainstream recording, particularly from the sales and the engineering, the production point of view, the people who started Olivia, Judy Dlugach, well, I don't want to mention the whole bunch, but there were several people who started. Judy was one, Ginny Burson was another, Meg Christian, and I think Jennifer Woodall. God, my memory is bad on the specifics. Ginny has just published a book on this called Olivia on the Record, which has the complete official account of this as near as Ginny has been able to reconstruct it, and it looks fairly accurate to me. So, you know, with some little exceptions, it's an account that you can check against mine to find out where my memory is defective. But women from the collective were looking around for an engineer with a little more experience than Joan, the engineer that they had at the time. They went to San Francisco. And they talked to, I believe, Leslie Ann Jones, who was at that time engineering up there, and told her about the collective and asked her if she wanted to join. And Leslie Ann was very busy at that time. And she said she couldn't do it or didn't want to do it. And I was one of the people that she mentioned as a possibility. And here our accounts differ. I didn't remember that Leslie Ann Jones had told them that I was trans, but apparently she did. And then when they got there, I also told them I was trans. So there was never any confusion about the fact that I was trans. And eventually, after a long period of mutual vetting, which in my memory took around a year, I think Ginny has a little more specifics, I went down and moved in with the collective. And people interpret this differently. Some people say I was hired. Well, you never get hired by the Olivia Collective. You don't get hired by a collective unless you're specifically designated as an employee.
I was you join
collective, right? I joined the collective, and I lived with the collective from that point up until the point that I left, and things went along fairly well. Before I joined, I did the B.B. Caroche album with them. B.B. Caroche was a group from the San Francisco Bay Area. We did a very nice rock album with them, but we were very inexperienced about how you go about this. So the group, as soon as we finished recording the album and before the album was released, the group broke up. So we didn't have anybody touring to support the album. We didn't have anything. And we released the album. It happened to be very good, but it had no support structure. So it wasn't possible for it to go very far, but it did pretty well for itself. Then I went to live with the collective, and we recorded Teresa Trull album, Berkeley Women's Music Collective, remastered Chris Williamson, Linda, we recorded Linda Tillery. I don't remember all the stuff that we did. We did quite a few albums.
There's a lot.
Very high time, an intense time. We were inventing women's music as we went along, and there was competition. There were other women's music companies, but we had something going for us in terms of our organization, the way we ran the company, the way we brought other women into relationship with it, and the way we were willing, I think, to support our distribution chain. And that went on for a while. And then in relation to me, we got a letter from Janice Raymond, whom I had never heard of, with what I thought were, well, later by reconstruction, I thought were parts of her book, but which turned out to be a chapter from what would become her dissertation, a chapter called Sappho by Surgery, which had actually apparently had a lot about me in it, but she had taken that part out and sent it to the collective and asked us to, would we please read this and send her back comments? And I think she expected that this would out me, but I don't think there was any need to out me because I was already out in the collective.
Yeah, she assumed that they didn't know that you were trans.
Yeah, and I had never made any secret of this. In a recent discussion with Ginny is inclined to think that while I thought everybody knew because I was never shy about talking about it, Ginny feels that there were some people who never got it. Now, I don't know this from my personal experience because when it came up, I just said, I'm trans. But apparently, I never said it in the presence of all the collective. My memory of how we dealt with the Raymond letter was that we pass it around to everybody in the collective, which is what you did with stuff that came into general attention. And you sent it around, with a comment sheet. Everybody wrote on a comment sheet. I wrote on it too. And eventually it got back to whoever was running the office at the time. It might have been Jenny or Sandy, momentary senior moment. I can't remember Sandy's last name, but it'll come back to me in a minute. Anyway, and then they sent it back to her, back to Janice Raymond with all our comments. And then sometime later, the book came out. And the book attacked me, Raymond. I don't want to mince words on this, so that everybody knows this. Janice Raymond, in her book, attacked me directly and ad hominem or ad feminem, whatever, as an individual, and did not treat me as an individual, as a human, worthy of being attacked as a human. She attacked me as some kind of object or animal. And I found that rather unpleasant. And after that, well, before the book came out, and after we sent her manuscript back to her, we began to get letters from women attacking me. And do you know where the Heritage Foundation sends out model legislation to different states? It looked like someone was cutting and pasting a letter, because they all had about the same form. There would be an initial paragraph about how much the person liked Olivia, and then there would be a paragraph shredding whatever our latest album was. From a technical point of view, the engineering is really bad, it would say. And then the next to last paragraph would say something about, we hear rumors that you have a transsexual engineer at Olivia, and why don't you think about getting rid of them? And then there would be a closing sentence or something.
So is the real argument here that a transsexual woman can't really be a woman?
Well, that was part of the argument, yes. And another part of the argument, which I found, and I think the rest of the collective found more interesting, was that a transsexual engineer mixed albums in a male way, and that male albums were offensive. And that I and various other people tried to figure out just what that meant. And it seemed to come down to that I tended to mix the drums in such a way that they were audible. And I didn't push the acoustic guitar up enough, which, if you stop to think about it, sounded like the first album we had ever done, which was Meg Christian in a garage with a guitar. And it sounded like whoever had written the original of this many copied letter was kind of longing for the bad old days of women's music, when we sounded like one woman in a garage with a guitar.
That's just amazing to hear this, because I worked many years in live and recorded music in the Bay Area, and I worked with many fine male and female engineers, and I can't imagine someone saying you mix like a male, or you're either good or you're not. That was the only criteria. And I was working at Zodiac News at that time, and one of our publications was a feminist news service called Hearsay. And it became a very big issue with my friend who was the publisher, and which she was, distressed by, the controversy. And we had discussed it, that it sounded, all of the stuff coming back to the collective sounded like more COINTELPRO stuff. The FBI saying, let's screw over this collective really good, so let's get a bunch of people to send hate mail. They were famous or infamous for that, and I wouldn't be surprised.
That's probably possible. It's also possible that while you and I think both of you and me and most other people think of what was happening in terms of, well, here's this weird information coming in and we need to counter it with rationality and love. When you're dealing with a lunatic fringe, you can't, it doesn't make any difference if you answer with rationality and love. They can't hear you. They're not responding to that. They're responding to their lunatic idea of what reality is. And it takes a long time to really learn that, to understand it, and to stop wasting time trying to reason with lunatics. And we never, during the lifetime of the collective, we never learned that. And I personally didn't learn it for decades afterward. Eventually, you just realize through an accumulation of information and watching what's happening with these people and watching how they move in the real world and interact with other people, that they are lunatic fringe and they're hopeless. And you just have to let go. You have to ignore them because there's nothing else you can do. They're going to go on ranting forever and they won't listen to reason and they won't listen to facts and they won't listen to real information, no matter how much of it you run at them. And somebody's microphone is making shot noise right now, I think. Anyway, that
fix it.
difference, we kept getting attacked by the lunatic fringe. And that went so far as, I think you know this, when we took the West Coast tour, women's music tour to Seattle, I was accosted by a local group of crazies who wore camo and shaved their heads and carried live weapons, and they threatened to kill me at the concert. And that had never happened quite like that before. There had been trans women before me who were, who were threatened violently in public context, but this appeared to be one step beyond that. Maybe the lunatic fringe felt it had to keep ratcheting up its action. But that happened in Seattle, and it scared the daylights out of me. But I didn't, obviously nobody shot at me. I got back to the Olivia Collective pretty much intact, except emotionally. And life went on. And eventually, without bothering to go into the gory details, things eventually ran down. I left the collective. The collective, it turned out, dissolved shortly thereafter, which I was not aware of. I never stopped having great respect and love for the Olivia Collective. In my opinion, they did everything right as best they could. Not they, we. I mean, I never stopped feeling that I was a member of the collective even after I left. So I think it would be more correct to say we did everything the best we could right up until the end. And what got us at the end, I think, well, according to Judy and Ginny, what got us at the end was finances. We weren't bringing in enough accounts receivable to support what was going out. And that's a cash flow problem that any business can have. And Olivia had it. And ultimately, it caused them to fold, but it didn't cause the overall Olivia idea to fold. Thank God, and thanks to a lot of tough thinking women at Olivia, Olivia mutated and became a women's travel company and went on to huge success at that. Rather than being a women's record company, Olivia is now a women's travel company. And
oh, interesting.
and they're doing extremely well now. They've got uh, some of the same women are there. Judy's still there. Many of the other collective members left when we ceased to be a women's record company. But Olivia lives, Olivia goes on, and Olivia still is a women's blank, 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 whatever. And I think if the travel business should dry up, which it did, momentarily during COVID, I think if that business ever goes away in a major way, then Olivia will mutate to be a women's ... something else. But the meta idea goes on.
Well, the the real entity is a collective that could do anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically women proving that women can do stuff.
Yeah, and work together to do it.
Women can do shit, period. And, women can do pretty much anything they want. And that was the idea that Olivia originally brought to the music business.
Well, there's kind of an idea that Empire Strikes Back was your response to Janice Raymond. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that is accurate, Your Honor.
So how did that come to be? I know that you were talking to Donna Haraway. Is that you met her around that time?
Well, Donna, through a series of circumstances and through meeting Donna, I got the formal superstructure, the framework in which to be able to say what I had to say. I think most people who knew me in the 70s knew that I was running around avoiding being an academic. I was trying to avoid getting involved with academia in any way that I could. And for me, academia was the hound of heaven, which is a reference to, for those of you who may not remember, it's a reference to a poem by T.S. Eliot. I was being followed around by this thing that was saying, this is what you are. This is who you are. Admit it. You've got to admit it. Everything you do in your life says this is what you are, and yet you're looking the other way. And that was right for me at the time. I was in Santa Cruz. I was crazy. I was surrounded by amiable crazies. I was having a crazy time in my life and loving it. But eventually, through circumstance and accident, I met Donna. And Donna and I had a wonderful conversation about cyborgs and the boundary between flesh and mechanics and so forth and so on. And I could spin that out for an hour here. Donna was at the time writing the Cyborg Manifesto, and we were talking about the concept, the idea of trans in relation to cyborgism, and how that, implied how that might relate to this work in progress that Donna was doing, for which she was gathering information.
So what's the connection between the concept of the cyborg and the trans experience, I guess?
Well, I don't want to, I could spend that out for an hour, but let's not bother. Donna's idea of a cyborg is only in passing the idea of a machine-human combination. Donna's idea of the cyborg is more abstract and operates on the level of identity. And I don't get into that territory of trying to interpret Donna's Cyborg Manifesto. There are a million people out there who do that. And I don't want to get into it beyond saying that Donna's idea of the cyborg is a tremendous tool, a force in the fight against. Now, here we get into some abstractions, in that I talk about them in a sense of abstractions. They're a fight against the idea of closure, first and foremost, which is work that I also did in my corner of that vineyard in a different way. But I can see you furrowing your brow. Okay, what
Well, I'm
is it?
just wondering about the concept of closure.
Okay, the concept of closure, as I'm using it here, means, well, let's talk about what isn't the concept of closure, and then we'll talk about the concept of closure. Our world, if you look at it from a distance, consists of a myriad of individual cultures with their ideas about how the world is put together and how one relates to other people and to the forces of nature, which you do or do not talk about in terms of gods. And each one of those cultures makes sense out of the world and out of the way they relate to the world through various systems of knowledge and of discourse. Now, when you look at them from a distance, each one of those is different and beautiful. But when you put them together, they don't match up. There isn't any overall master idea that incorporates them all. Each one of them is different. And if you go visit each one of those cultures, from inside that culture, each one of them is valid and it works for that culture. It answers a certain number of problems. That doesn't mean that each one is perfect or works for everybody in that culture. We know that in many of them, various people in that culture are part of a class of people who are oppressed in the interest of making the larger culture work. And who that is varies from culture to culture. In many, it includes women, and in many, it includes people who are not like, ethnically like the majority of that culture. If you look from culture to culture, you may or may not, I'm not going to get into this, you know, there may be one particular group that's oppressed in all of them. I don't think so. But the important thing for our purposes here is that each one is different. And if you look at them from a distance, you can't find any one thing that describes them all. Now, closure is saying there is one master narrative that you can construct or state that subsumes all of these cultures, that describes them all, that encloses them all, that in some way makes some, through language, some description that includes all of them.
Sounds like Dharma.
If you will. Yeah. All right.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. If you grant that, then you can also say that you have now one description that includes all of this. And you now have nothing outside that. That's narrative closure in the sense in which I'm talking about it.
It sounds like you're saying that there's no chance of a unified theory of cultures, that cultures are valid to themselves.
I'm saying this, but at the same time, I'm a disciple of Franz Boas, who, well, structuralism, if you happen to believe in structuralism, you do think that there may be a way to describe all of this, even if it's only at the meta level, because you have a structure, and a structure implies your knowledge of a set of relationships that you can put together to make that structure. And I don't want to get into that very deeply because that involves some, we're going to have to unpack some tough stuff here. And I don't want to do that during this interview. But closure is something that we see in terms of talking about the world as a just so story. This is the way it is. That's closure. I can make a whole system to describe this, whatever that this is. that's closure. And we tend to see those things in relationship to describing the world in terms that you can, that we frequently see as being gendered. And I don't want to go there right now because that's a deep rabbit hole. But I do see that.
It seems to me like it's kind of like saying everybody has a toolkit, but everybody's toolkit may be a little bit different.
Yeah.
And if you know, if you don't have any screwdrivers in your toolkit, you can't deal with screws, right?
Well,
So
yeah.
your perception of the world and the way you construct it depends a lot on what you've got in your toolkit.
Yes. And let me go at that moment to point out how this eventually got me into academia, because this is what got me kicked out of the science studies program at UC San Diego. I had gone down there for 1 year at Donna's suggestion to be what we were talking about as kind of a bridge from a very traditionally run science studies program, you know, history of science, philosophy of science, that kind of thing. I was supposed to introduce the element of critical and cultural studies into traditional science studies, just in a way of, here's this thing in your toolkit. Would any of you guys like to come up to history of consciousness and, you know, spend a semester up there or a quarter up there, and we'll come down there, you know, we'll do some exchange, we'll all broaden our knowledge and everybody will be happy. But it turned out that one of the papers that I wrote while I was in the science studies program at UC San Diego said, and I'm going to talk literally about what I said because it relates to what we were just talking about. I said, here's this scientific idea, here's this discourse, here's this discourse, here's this discourse. Instead of trying to get closure with them, to create a single narrative, let's try holding them in productive tension with each other. Okay, people down there said, what does that mean? I said, think about that outside what we're talking about in traditional, the way you do history of science. You know, this happened, then that happened, then that happened. Think outside that linear temporal frame. Here's an account, here's an account. We're in a kind of a phase space here where we want to put this one here, that one there, and then create tensions between them and see what comes out of that. Oh boy, that got me thrown out. Literally, it got me thrown out of the program. And because my being in the program was what was grounding my being in San Diego, that got me kicked out of UC San Diego and being about to be sent back home to Santa Cruz. Boom, overnight, I was out.
Wow.
And then something odd happened. The chair of the sociology department at that time came into my office while I was packing my stuff and said, I hear you've been kicked out. I said, yeah. He said, how would you like to be faculty? I said, you're kidding, right? No, we'll sign you on as an instructor. Just hang out here, don't go away. So I said, okay, twist my arm, ouch, ouch. I mean, it's San Diego, right? It's a wonderful place. It's very conservative on one hand. And like almost any really conservative university, it has these really pockets of really wonderful shit going on. And I knew where they were. And I thought, this is fantastic. So I stayed there. And I got to hang out with Dan Norman while he was building this wonderful interdisciplinary science studies program there. while they were building the building in which it was going to be. And I went over to performing arts, where they had this wonderful group of people who were there doing cutting edge work in performance studies and poetry, which had not yet surfaced into the mainstream, where it was really visible in the university, and where they were thinking about the groundwork for a digital arts program. All this wonderful fomenting happening, bubbling up from the foundations.
Now, this sounds like the case of coming into a place where you get assigned to the wrong tribe.
Yeah.
And just as you're leaving, the guys from the other tribes, who are really your tribes, see that you're leaving and say, hey, wait, come play with us.
Yes. And because I wasn't in any of those tribes, I had an advantage. I could move between them and really learn the best of what each of them had to offer, and take that away and try to give it back to the university as a whole. Because in the meantime, what was happening with me personally was I was teaching in anthropology, sociology, English, history, political science, and an experimental program called Making of the Modern World. So I was kind of jumping around through all of these and having a great time at it. And because I wasn't attached to any of them, I was free to, it was a little vertiginous, because I had to come up with one in each department every quarter in order to keep funded. But it kept happening. I at the time didn't have any trouble doing that. I don't want to demean anyone else who may have been having trouble being funded at that time. All I can say is I was having a wonderful time, and I didn't have any trouble getting jobs in any of these departments when I wanted them. In fact, the word was out that they were looking for me. So it was more a case of which one am I going to teach in this time? And there's a limit to the number of courses you can teach in a given semester. But I was up to my limit and just having the time of my life at it.
So this was you finding your comfort with academia, right?
Right. And remember, all this time I'm doing this, I'm still technically a graduate student, which puts me in a position where I'm not responsible to the university in the same way that an actual tenure line faculty member would be, which means that I'm a lot more free to experiment and to choose what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it, as long as there are people out there who want me to do that. And so that's what I'm doing. I have, in essence, I have staked out for myself this territory in the university under the radar that nobody is occupying, but in which there's freedom to do what's right for me.
And what's the path from there to ACTLab?
God knows. I would probably still be. When you're in this situation, a couple of things normally happen. People say to you, hang around, Sandy, we'll open up a tenure line for you. Now, if people are saying that to you, the odds are that if you hang around long enough, it will actually happen. But being me, I'm Jewish, I always live in catastrophe mode. Somebody is going to come along and get you eventually. I mean, that's the history of my people. So you can't actually trust that the tenure line will actually open up. So your feelers are always out there for something to happen. And what did happen is that the University of Texas headhunted me. And that's how I wound up in the ACTLab. Well, that's how I wound up at UT. And after I was there for a few months, a year, whatever it was, and kind of got my feet on the ground in a very minor way and had a chance to look around, I invented the ACTLab. And that's how we got going. Now, you could say at this point, well, what does invented the ACTLab mean? There are logical ways forward in an academic structure in which you can propose programs, and then you have to find ways to fund them. And there are standard pathways by which you do that. I didn't do any of that. I just said, let's do this thing called the ACTLab. I don't care if we have funding. I don't care what the traditional structure is. Let's just do it. And we did.
But you had an idea what it needed to be.
Yes, but how that actually happened, what the logistics of that were, what the funding was, how we staffed that, where the students came from, none of that happened through any traditional university channel. And that put me at odds with the people who ran my own department. And I think what the people who ran the university were doing off in the distance were going, wow, this is great. We're just going to watch this, but not intervene. Kind of like the gods. You could write a kind of a Homeric form of the creation of the ACTLab with the gods looking on from a distance. Because in the moment in my department, the people who ran my department didn't want the ACTLab. They never wanted the ACTLab. They never wanted anything like the ACTLab. And they were willing to fight against having the ACTLab in any way that they could. And they immediately set about trying to get rid of me. And they were very hard at it.
It was a communication school, and I guess it sort of didn't fill into any framework that was familiar to them, because you were talking about media of the future, right? Which they couldn't see and they hadn't worked with.
Correct. In some vague theoretical way, they wanted some interdisciplinary thing, but they couldn't get it because they had no idea what they were talking about. And eventually, given any university structure, eventually they'll come up with something that everybody can agree on that will let them move forward with traditional structure and funding. But the way that always works is by the time they figure that out, it's over. So it was important that we do it. I mean, it was important to me and the students and everyone who was involved, including you. It was important that we move forward in our own way under the radar and not wait for the university to figure it out on their own.
I couldn't see anywhere else at that university or any other that I had been anywhere near where they were doing this sort of thing that you were doing, because, it's basically like Maker Faire academic version,
Well, in their own way, they were trying, and they were very in their way to move toward that, but they didn't want me in on it. And we don't know all the reasons why they didn't want me in on it. I mean, logically, if anyone up the chain of command at any time had said, Sandy, let me take you by the shoulders here. Let me take you in my arm here and tell you, we are going around secretly raising money to do this very thing you are doing. Why don't you just shut up and become part of it? But nobody ever did that at any time. And I don't know that we'll ever know why. At the departmental level, there's no question that transphobia was part of it.
Yeah, I was going to ask that question, actually.
I don't know that transphobia was all of it. I was also a wild card because I didn't play the departmental games. So there were other reasons that were definitely in play, but the fact that you're trans and the fact that you don't play the game is like 60% strikes against you. So you've now got 120% of a strike against you out of the gate.
Well, playing the game is such a big deal. I mean, the reason that I never became an academic, and it certainly, there were a lot of reasons that it would have made sense for me to, you know, stay in academia, work my way through, become a professor, whatever. But the politics were just, and I got to look at the politics. You know, I was hanging out with TAs and people like that, and I could see what the politics were like. And like I was in the English department. English department politics is like brutal, just brutal. I didn't want any part of that.
Unfortunately, I think almost all academic politics are brutal, and people talk about why. I mean, academics talk about why. The favorite argument is that there's so little to fight over that it makes everybody like that. And that may be true. And the other thing is that academics are probably the most infantilized social group in the world. I mean, next to brain surgeons, I think academics are the most infantilized. And so very few academics really learn how to behave as adults in the real world.
That's a good point. I mean, you had sort of been in the real world. You didn't like kind of go through the whole academic path and like step by step, but you took off into different things, right? You were not a traditional academic.
Yeah, well, in my own negative defense, I never went around making friends and shaking hands and patting people on the back and kissing babies and doing any of that. I'm not good at that. And I didn't see it as a strength. And therefore, I didn't see that it behooved me to waste any time on it because there was an enormous task and time was short. So I went right to that. By the way, parenthetically here, notice that we've completely bypassed the issue of The Empire Strikes Back, but we can come back to that later if you want. It wasn't on the ACTLab path. It was on a different path. So,
well, I mean, we can't go back to The Empire Strikes Back. I wanted to make sure that we got the UT thing in, but I think that we sort of discussed that pretty well. The one thing that I recall hearing when you were having some issues around tenure and that sort of thing was, I think that there were some people there who were a little put off by the fact that you had roles in other places than UT. You know, like you had what you were doing with Banff or what you were doing in Europe. You had other things going on.
There was that, and there was, and this is true. It sounds egotistical, but this has nothing to do, I don't want this to have anything to do with my ego, because I want people to understand how this works academically. I was too popular. One of the things that was said about me when I arrived at UT was that I was a star, and stars are very bad to have in certain departments.
Your students were all really excited about what they were doing with you.
That's true.
I can't think of anybody who wasn't.
But the fact that I was being thought of as a star was disruptive to the traditional way that the flow of the department at the administrative level.
Well, have you followed the current uproar at the University of Texas, where they are unable to cope with the changes in the student body and the demands of the student body? Things like, you know, getting rid of the Eyes of Texas as the official song, and just, you know, the political uprisings that have occurred on campus and in the community they seem to have a real problem dealing with it. They're still wanting to be good old UT like it has always been.
Okay, I want to say a paragraph here in defense of the University of Texas at Austin. I can't say anything for the rest of the university system because I have no firsthand experience of it. But the University of Texas at Austin is an example of my refuse closure statement. They've got some really world-class problems to deal with. Number one, they've always been progressive. That may fly in the face of what you see, but even while I was still there, they were working on ways of diversity and inclusion on a very practical ground. I was the member of a committee. I didn't form it. I didn't instigate it. I was a member of a committee that was working on practical methods at the instigation of the university, working on practical methods to change the computer system by which students recorded their identity so that there would be room for students to have names of choice in addition to their legal names. That's a hell of a big step for an institution that size. Now, on the other hand, where does most of the university's endowment come from? It comes from these old guard oil men who are incredibly backward and conservative, who are transphobic, who are racist in the deepest sense of those words. Not all of them, but many of them. And they make no secret of it. They make no bones of that. And they provide the backbone of the finances for the University of Texas to go on.
Yeah, it's just like the government of Texas. Those are the guys who buy the government here, and we get the government that they pay for.
So what do you do in that situation? I mean, you saw that come up very recently with the critical race theory business.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
You had major donors saying, if you don't stop with this critical race theory nonsense, we're going to take back our money.
Quit teaching the damn history of the country.
That's a real threat. And somebody at the university has the responsibility of juggling these guys, because they're mostly guys, with the reality of diversity and inclusion. And I don't want to be that person.
So I feel kind of bad that we didn't finish with The Empire Strikes Back, and we have about 5 minutes. Do you want to summarize what that was about?
I can do that. I met Donna. I was not an academic when Donna and I talked. Shortly thereafter, the Hound of Heaven caught up with me and bit me. I got into a situation where I was asked to teach, to be a teaching assistant at the university. I was not a student, but they had run out of, they didn't have enough graduate students at that point for all the classes they needed. So they were looking for other qualified people to help with teaching assistant. I volunteered. I wound up there. I was gobsmacked. I had my moment of religious conversion in which I couldn't deny it anymore. I was here. I was in the academic environment. What else needed to be said to me? And I gave into it. I became an academic. And how that happened was like a religious conversion. It was a transformation in my life. It literally involved visions in which I saw myself moving from one life to another life and becoming an academic. And shortly thereafter, I applied to the History of Consciousness program. I was turned down. I got in and almost immediately went to San Diego and then to UT. I was already on tenure track at UT, when I got my PhD at History of Consciousness. So there we are. I was actually physically in History of Consciousness for 1 year. During that year, I wrote The Empire Strikes Back as a paper for Donna. I delivered it at a conference that year at UT, and then we went on from there. That's
the rest is history. So The Empire Strikes Back was, we were talking about how it was a response to the I guess, contentions of Janice Raymond. How did that work as a response?
It became the foundation for an academic discipline that arose around it called Transgender Studies, logically. Everything everyone has done since then in Transgender Studies, I find quite marvelous and amazing, and to me personally, heartwarming. There's so much good stuff happening now, so much good critical work, so much good, really incisive criticism of the TERF world, the trans-exclusionary radical feminist world, that I find absolutely wonderful. And there's more of it every day. There's more than I could possibly have imagined. When I wrote The Empire Strikes Back, I imagined someday there would be an academic conference at which someone would stand up and say, all right, all trans scholars, let's caucus over here. And then everybody goes over and you have a caucus. But I never dreamed I would see that during my lifetime. And I've seen something way, way, way more than that during my lifetime.
And I'm sure that that's influenced the fact that people are more comfortable with kind of coming out as who they really are, you know?
Well, you can say it better than I can, because I don't know all the consequences of it. I just know the ones I know and the ones that mean a lot to me, which is we now have hundreds, possibly thousands of transgender academics. We have people who are unafraid to talk about their transness.
Well, exactly. And there's a lot of controversy about trans right now, but at the same time, it's so much more an acceptable thing, you know?
No growth without pain, buddy.
Yeah. And there's always going to be people who sort of resist, especially things that they don't completely understand, you know, and that they can't really kind of get their head around.
The people.
Well, I keep thinking about how this whole idea of gender is kind of screwy, you know, to try to put somebody in one box or another box, because there's a lot of boxes. I mean, it's like the blue sky is one thing, but the rainbow is quite another.
Say it. Just say it. That's you're saying it a lot better than I could. So, by the way, this is Schrodinger.
Hey, Schrodinger. Is that cat dead or alive?
He doesn't know.
Scoop, what were you saying?
I would just observe that the people making a big controversy about trans rights, especially in Texas, are the usual suspects who are opposed to anything that is outside of their worldview. And that's just become the standard operating procedure, and particularly the Republican Party. If it's different, we're against it.
Well, it's scary to them, and I kind of empathize with the fact that people have their fears, and the challenge is trying to figure out how to get them past that and get them to open their heads. And you know, that's what we've been talking about for 50 years.
I agree. The thing is, you get that far, and then shit happens, and you move back a little bit, and then you get the opportunity to do it all over again. And that happens in each of our generations. We never get there, but we move a little bit further. We move closer to it.
I thought we had gone so far. You know, we had a black president and everything, and then suddenly there's Trump. And it's like we slide way back.
Yeah, this goes by 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. That's the way you move toward universal freedom and enlightenment, or whatever you want to call that thing we're all moving toward. Or hopefully.
Hopefully. Well, I think we have reached the end of our hour together. And really thank you. This has been another great conversation, and we'll have to do it again. Thanks
so much, you folks. I think the end is signaled by Max coming along to try to get my attention. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I wish that my cat was as cooperative as Max is.
And thank you, Max, a good timekeeper.
All right, off we go. We will see you soon, Sandy.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lepkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.